You do.
Welcome, everyone. This is Jeremy Rogers, the Political Advocacy Director and Staff Counsel at the Oregon Association of Realtors. I'm relatively new to the association, for those of you who have not met, but I'm a staff person in charge of the government affairs of the association, and I will hand it over briefly to Sean Gillians to introduce himself.
Good morning, all, and thank you for joining us. I'm Sean Gillians. I serve as your chief lobbyist and have had the opportunity to represent you all for a little over a dozen years now. Surprising to hear the numbers that we have on this webinar. It's clearly a sign the market must be slowing down if you all are willing to sit here and listen to two attorneys prattle on about the legislative session at 9:30 in the morning on a Monday.
But we do thank you for that, and we're going to go through the highlights of the legislative session and have a lot of room for questions. So please send in your questions, and we'll take those as they come as we're going through each bill, and hopefully we can answer all those for you. We do also on the OAR website have additional FAQs, and we will be producing a legislative report that will come out in a couple of weeks that will also go through these bills in more detail. So we'll start with a little context of the legislative session. So there were 38 Democrats and 22 Republicans in the Oregon House of Representatives after the last election in 2018, and 18 Democrats and 12 Republicans in the Senate. This is significant because that represents what we call a supermajority in both chambers of the legislature. And in Oregon, supermajorities are required for tax increases, and so both houses of the legislature had enough votes to increase taxes if they voted along party lines. This was the first time since 1983 since there was a supermajority of Democrats in both chambers of the legislature.
Yeah, and Jeremy, I think the real stark difference in this session from previous sessions, not only were we talking about those supermajorities, but we're also talking about a governor from the same party too. So there really wasn't as much of a balance or a check there. And with the number of 38 to 22, for the first time in my career, we saw committees, rather than being a single vote majority in the House. So historically, something like the Housing Committee would have 9 members, and it would be 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans on there. For the first time, we saw it be 6-3. And so I have told the story as I've gone around and sort of talked about that we had one of our big bills up, mortgage interest deduction. We had a Democrat who was not supportive of moving the bill forward. And I thought, oh, great, we've got it bottled up in committee. That oh great lasted about 4 minutes before I realized, I just lost the bill 5-4 because there were that numbers. And really the frustrating part of that, I think, for those members of the minority party is they weren't consulted at all. Because when you have 6-3 and a chair can even lose one member of their party, they're not interested at all in what the minority party has to say. And I think as we get into the bills, you'll sort of see that really spread this urban-rural divide further and further as the session went along.
So heading into the session, it was relatively clear from the leaders of the majority party in the legislature and the governor what some of the big issues and legislative goals that they wanted to accomplish were. So one of those was a major business tax overhaul to fund the priorities of what was called the Joint Committee on Student Success, which was a committee of the legislature that had spent the previous year looking into ways to improve Oregon's high school graduation rates, and they traveled all over the state and met with a lot of people. And it was sort of an inevitability that in the 2019 legislative session, there would be some major business tax increase to pay for the priorities of that committee. Medicaid financing was another. Oregon expanded its Medicaid program under the Federal Affordable Care Act several years ago. And as part of that, it added about 400,000 people that are covered under Medicaid. And the state did not have a permanent way of paying for that. And so every legislative session, there's been an effort to close a gap in that funding. This session, there was a gap of around $800 million. And so finding revenue sources to pay for that was a huge priority for the legislative leaders. Greenhouse gas regulation and pricing. I'm sure you heard much about the cap and trade program that was discussed in the legislative session that led to some walkouts of the Republicans in the Senate. That was a major priority heading into the session for the leaders. Housing, and we'll talk about many of those bills here today. And then also employment and workplace regulation, and particularly a focus on passing a paid family leave program.
Yeah, and I think OAR has their own unique niche as far as what we're looking at and what we focus on, and housing certainly was a top priority for OAR there. We'll talk about it too in the employment side. Independent contractor status, I know, was a really big deal there. You all on the webinar are certainly impacted by business taxation as well, but we were able at least to sort of navigate a path where the vast majority of our brokers thankfully won't be subject to the tax, but it still will have very real impacts on some of our brokerages.
So just talk a little bit about our process before we go into the bills. We have legislative policies that are adopted by the board of directors. Those are drafted by the Government Affairs Key Committee and then go to the board of directors for approval, and do that every 2 years. Those are sort of higher level policies and principles. They're not specific legislation, but they are policy guidance in various areas, private property rights, taxation, housing supply, other areas. Those are approved by the board of directors, and then the Government Affairs Key Committee uses those higher level policy principles to evaluate the bills that come forward in the legislative session, and then OAR will take a position in support, opposition, not take a position, just monitor the bills, and oftentimes start out in a position of opposition, but then work to amend a bill and maybe come to a position of support. So there were more than 3,000 bills introduced this legislative session. And so between staff, Sean, lobbyists, and the committee, we went through all those bills, figured out which ones were most relevant to the association and its members, figured out how they lined up with our principles, and then took positions accordingly. We also have a political affairs key committee that is in charge of the Realtor Day at the Capitol event, and we'll talk a little bit more about that event later. And thank you all for those who participated. We had more than 800 Realtor members that came to that, and it really is unique in Oregon politics that an industry association can turn out that many people to the Capitol to talk to their elected leaders.
And I think there's a couple key things to highlight there. One, you mentioned the Government Affairs Committee. It's made up of Realtor members from around the state. They put in an inordinate amount of work during the session. We can't thank them enough. They meet, if not every other week, at times during peak times of the session, every single week, to go over bills and sort of look at the impacts that they have on the real estate industry. And we really owe a big debt to them for that. And just give a sense of how many bills they go through. A typical session of the 3,000 to 3,500 will usually track around 500 that we're keeping track of. And so, it really is a lot of work for that committee, and we appreciate everything that they do there. Jeremy sort of mentioned that we start sometimes in opposition and end up in support for bills. I think that leads us perfectly into our next slide on sort of how that happened on a variety of the housing bills.
Great. And Sean, do you want to take 2001?
Everyone don't fire off your questions immediately. I will get through at least 2 sentences before I'm sure the switches light up. So many folks have seen a lot of the press around House Bill 2001. It has been labeled the death of single family housing. I think that's likely a stretch. And one of the things we came into the session focusing on was increasing housing supply statewide. The state economist had predicted that we needed 155,000 additional units as of today for the population that we have and the folks that have come to Oregon already. And that does not account for future expansion as folks move primarily to the Portland metro area and southern and central Oregon. So we wanted to make a focus on how can we increase housing supply. The speaker put forward House Bill 2001, which in its simplest form says that going forward, that neighborhoods that have single family residences and are zoned for such are going to have to allow duplexes or up to a fourplex, depending on the size of the locality, basically city size. And the thresholds are 10,000 population and 25,000. We had significant concerns with the bill as it started. I think we were pretty public with our concerns as the session started to come to fruition. And, you know, you sort of see the tale of two bills here. House Bill 2001 and Senate Bill 608, which we'll get into more. House Bill 2001, the speaker had a problem where she didn't have the full support of her caucus, even though it was her top priority bill. Senate Bill 608, she did. And so you saw some bipartisan work on 2001 and working with the minority party to sort of resolve a lot of our concerns. And then in Senate Bill 608, you saw the exact opposite, where they rammed the bill through in a single day without any amendments. And so, you know, I think the key things to highlight from 2001, we got significant safeguards in there to make sure that this enhanced potential capacity was not counted against buildable lands going forward in urban growth boundaries unless the development actually occurs, which there's a lot of data thus far to show it's not going to be an overnight change. And then two, we got some significant improvements to how we actually calculate buildable lands and housing needs for urban growth boundary expansions. And I think this will be a bill that 10 years from now we look back on as one of the signature victories of improvements in the land use system. And it's something that the Oregon Association of Realtors, to a lesser extent, the Oregon Home Builders Association, and what was Oregonians in Action have been working collectively on for a number of years, these changes to buildable lands and housing needs analysis.
Yeah, that also leads into House Bill 2003, which moved alongside 2001 and also creates some additional improvements and accountability to ensure that needed housing units are getting built. That bill actually requires the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department to conduct regional housing needs analysis for each city and metro and estimate existing housing stocks, conduct a housing shortage analysis, and estimate the number of housing units needed at each segment of the market to accommodate anticipated growth over the next 20 years. So, and if it's a city with over 10,000 population, that city has to produce a strategy, a housing production strategy to show how it's going to get those units built. So this added sort of another layer on top of Goal 10 and the existing process to create some accountability at the state level to ensure that cities and metro are getting the units built that are needed for the growth that's happening in the state. And there's a lot of reporting back to the legislature on this so that they can stay apprised and make sure that this work is happening.
Yeah, I think that's the State Department Land Conservation and Development for most of its history has been focused on conservation and not necessarily focused on development. And I think this session in particular really started to force them to make a stronger look at development and making sure that cities were keeping up their end of the bargain as far as ensuring that if they're going to artificially constrain land supply, that development inside that boundary is actually going to be able to occur. And I think that rolls right into the skinny lot bill. The skinny lot bill 534 really was one aimed at the city of Portland, where you had a number of lots that were already platted for single family residence, but they didn't necessarily meet the minimum lot size, which I think in the city of Portland is probably around 5,000 square feet. but you could very easily, if you're trying to encourage density, put a skinnier house on there and still achieve all your setbacks that you need and have that house in there. And, you know, quite frankly, Portland talks a lot about wanting density right up until the neighborhoods complain about it. And then they don't allow the development. So this was very interesting to watch this bill move through the process. I think it died at least 3 different times and was resurrected at the very last day of session. And effectively, it's for larger population cities. If you have these existing lots that have been platted for single family residence, you have to actually allow it on there.
There's also several efforts to increase funding sources for housing production. One of those that we supported at OAR was House Bill 2055. This was actually a priority of the governor, and it came out of her regional solutions effort. One of the, that's an effort, sort of a multi-agency effort focused on economic development. And one of the things that's become clear over the last several years is that the lack of housing supply for workforces is becoming a major economic development constraint in the state, all across the state, including in rural communities. And so this bill was to create some additional funding that would be allowed to be used to support housing development where you have a situation where there's economic development opportunities that can't be realized because of lack of housing supply. Originally, it was $15 million that the governor had proposed in her budget. It ended up, the bill itself didn't actually pass, but $5 million, and the program did pass in the Oregon Housing and Community Services budget. And that's something that we'll continue to revisit and hopefully can find some additional resources for in the future. House Bill 2056 also moved alongside the 2055 effort. That it also is related to funding sources at the Department of Oregon Housing Community Services Department. And that bill sort of expands upon some of the existing programs, loan guarantee programs, and other programs that they have at the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department, more focused on the low income side rather than on workforce housing. This bill didn't add any additional funds, but it sort of expanded the uses of existing funds and took some funds that were for loan guarantee programs and made them available as a grant program.
Yeah, I think if you look at the expanding housing supply list there, the 5 bills we've sort of highlighted, you've got sort of no silver bullet there. You've got different efforts to get at the problem in different ways. And I think it's a pretty good balance there. You've got some government subsidies, which ultimately are going to be required for the lowest of income of folks on the rental side in particular. And then you've got some private sector encouragement. And, you know, I think we were happy that we sort of got to see both this session. In previous sessions, we've just focused on the government programs and subsidies, and we'll never get our way out of this housing crisis and the affordability problems that we have with just government subsidies alone. We have to encourage the private sector and ensure that that housing is getting built. So, you know, I think personally it was a pretty good session around housing supply. Obviously, there are programs that we're going to have to keep an eye on, and we're going to have to tweak them as they move forward. But really a good start.
All right, so we'll talk about
not so good start. Landlord tenants.
I'll start with 2 smaller ticket items, and then we'll get to the big kahuna. Senate Bill 970. This is a bill that did pass. It adjusted what is allowable for landlords to screen for tenants. So the simple change that this bill made was that landlords are not allowed to screen for convictions based solely on the use or possession of marijuana. Senate Bill 483, which of course is legal now in Oregon.
Yeah. So let's just, for those folks, particularly those who are listening in from the Portland metro region, let's make clear what this bill was versus what the city of Portland has proposed. The city of Portland has basically proposed not being able to use background checks almost effectively at all. The things like breaking and entering and felony burglary charges, you could no longer screen tenants for, because of course you should trust someone in your rental place that has broken into someone else's place and stolen stuff. That's not what Senate Bill 970 was about at all. It really was just limited to previous marijuana convictions, particularly around possession of marijuana, which is legal now. And, you know, I think we've seen sort of this push in the legislative assembly to wipe out those convictions in their entirety. And I think you'll continue to see that, particularly from our judiciary chairs. And so, you know, it sort of makes sense as we try and eliminate these previous convictions, that those would no longer be a criteria. But very narrow bill, and not nearly as problematic as what Commissioner Udaley and the City of Portland have proposed.
So Senate Bill 484, this bill, the change that it requires is that if you're a landlord with multiple units and you have a single tenant applying to multiple units, you can only charge one rental application fee rather than multiple. And then, of course, we have Senate Bill 608, which I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with at this point. We'll get into this a bit, but I do want to point out that at the OAR website, you can find an FAQ on 608. You can also find the recording of a previous webinar done on this, where a prominent landlord-tenant attorney walked through all the aspects of the bill. So we do encourage you to take a look at that. I'm gonna turn this one over to Sean.
I've never heard of this bill. So Senate Bill 608, I had the, I'll put air quotes because you all can't see our smiling faces, thankfully, opportunity to go present to NAR too about how we were the first state in the nation to lose statewide rent control. And, you know, I think there's a couple of things to sort of talk about at the onset of that. One, we had been dealing with this issue for a few sessions in a row. We were successful back in the 90s, along with the home builders, in putting a preemption in on rent control at the state legislative assembly. And there had been a number of bills introduced with some pretty serious momentum to get rid of that cap or that preemption on rent control. And I think there was very strong concern that particular entities, Portland, Eugene, Ashland, would put in draconian sort of rent caps, similar to what we've seen in the Bay Area, particularly with San Francisco, where you have effectively a program where landlords can't raise the rent at all. So that was sort of the backdrop, and we had sort of worked very well with all of our members. Thank you all for responding to the calls to action over the variety of sessions and showing up to Realtor Day at the Capitol, making your voice heard there. In coming into the 19th session in the 2018 election, we lost one of our champions in the Senate, who actually was an incredibly progressive Democrat who had a 30-year career of supporting not only the public employee unions, but many of these advocates who pushed for the bill. And while there were tenants groups that pushed for it, the biggest drivers, honestly, behind rent control were SEIU, the state's public employee union. And he had been very supportive of their issues, but on this one issue, he was a landlord and did not support rent control. And they engaged in one of the most vitriolic primary campaigns I've seen. And they took him out in a primary with their chosen candidate. And so I think folks were very skittish, folks being the legislative members, about opposing rent control coming into the session. The speaker did negotiate with one landlord group, Oregon Rental Housing Association, which is primarily smaller landlords, and their biggest concern was being able to keep no-cause evictions. They weren't necessarily as concerned about rent control, and you sort of see the 4-unit threshold for relocation payments. That's very sort of emblematic of their membership. So ultimately, you saw their executive director, while he said that they were neutral on the bill, he effectively testified in support and and gave sort of the landlord cover for there. So we were in a difficult position as the session started, and leadership made the determination that they would not accept any amendments whatsoever. I want to thank all the Realtor members who not only responded to the calls to action, but we had a number of members drive in from all over the state. And unfortunately, the charade around this bill and the building is probably one of the more disturbing things I've seen, where folks were only given 90 seconds each. And at the end, the chair was unwilling to even accept a single amendment. So it was effectively demonstrating that the decision was already made. They had a public hearing, which is sort of our process, where typically you have a public hearing, then you wait a little while, then you have a work session. They did it all in one evening and moved the bill immediately through the Senate. In the House, we had the exact same process where they cut everyone down to 90 seconds. And I sort of said to the chair, who in the House, we've worked well with her in the past. I said, you know, it's pretty disturbing that the state's largest private property rights group was excluded from the conversation and limited down to 90 seconds in both chambers. Because I really think that we could have improved the bill, even if we didn't get it to a position of even neutrality. There were some issues raised, particularly by Representative Jack Zika, who is a Realtor member, who represents the Redmond area, and he sits on the Housing Committee. There was some real concerns raised on that bill. So the bill sailed through. The bill did not allow for any amendments. We are already seeing drastic decreases in investment in rental properties, out of state folks. So, I mean, we were very much in the national news for this. Ironically, California, which just defeated a statewide ballot measure for rent control, it looks like their legislative assembly is going to ram it through now too, that Oregon did it. And I think that was one of the big concerns for many ours. If a single state fell, that you would sort of see this moving forward. So that's the big picture stuff. As Jeremy mentioned, there are FAQs. We continue to update that. Kayla did a great job with the webinar that you guys can access on the website. If anyone's got questions they want to type in specifically about 608, Jeremy and I were sort of discussing, you know, the thoughts around the 4-unit exemption and how it applies. So you've got 2 attorneys here going back and forth on it, which means 4 opinions came out. And I think that's what you're going to see for a while, as unfortunately some of these provisions are going to be litigated, and that will give us our answers.
We do have a question from someone on the line here about Senate Bill 88.
We will be getting to Senate Bill 88, which is rural ADUs. Yep. That's coming down the list. And I would put fixes to Senate Bill 608 and Senate Bill 88 as unfinished business and things that we're going to move forward on as we go forward.
Yeah, and in particular, we know it's very concerning with 608 that there's a 90-day notice requirement if a home's being sold to a person who's going to occupy as an owner occupier, and that timeline does not line up with many important loan programs, including FHA and VA and others. And so that's going to be a major focus of ours to try to improve that portion moving forward. Before we move on to the next slide, I want to apologize about leaving one important category out that we'll hit on right now, and that's business taxation. So I want to talk about the bill that we mentioned earlier, the major business tax increase that passed. So this was House Bill 3427, and it's essentially a tax on gross receipts. Basically, if you have revenues over $1 million, then the tax kicks in, and it's a tax of 0.57% on business gross receipts over $1 million. There is a deduction allowable of 35% for either labor costs or costs of goods sold. Now, in terms of how this plays out for realtors, the tax does not apply to the value of home sales, just to the value of commissions, and the tax does not apply to the tax only applies to the commissions retained by the realtor and commissions retained by the brokerage. And that was an important change that we solidified in the process of amending the bill, because we were very concerned that either that the bill could tax the value of home sales, which would have been very terrible, or that the bill would tax revenues before commissions were distributed to brokers, in which case there'd be a lot more brokerages out there and total revenues out there that would pass the $1 million threshold and be taxed. As it stands now, if a brokerage retains more than $1 million in revenue after it's paid out its broker commissions, it would be subject to the tax. And if an individual broker had more than $1 million in commissions, they would be subject to the tax, but otherwise will not be.
Yeah, and I think while it's not on the slide, I think it actually does sort of fit into are we serious about affordable home ownership or not? I was approached by a lobbyist the other day at an event who represents a nonprofit. And the nonprofit has been soliciting donations for a number of years to build a new building for themselves. And it's all donations from folks. The budget for this new building, it's in the Portland metro area, was $14 million. And so he was concerned about the gross receipts tax and hadn't been involved at all in the conversations. And he said, well, are there going to be any sort of changes to it? And I said, well, you know, I think it's going to be hard to get significant changes. What are you trying to get at? And he said, well, that $14 million project, our general contractor just came back and gave us a $600,000 increase because of the tax. And that's where you see where general contractors didn't get the same treatment as realtors got in this bill. And general contractors are responsible for all gross revenue that's coming in, even if it's going out to subcontractors. And so I think you're going to see a very real hit. And some of the other stuff they said too is we've got an increase in cost of wood because it's going to be subject in the entire supply chain. Jeremy knows this better than anyone about pyramiding. As you move up the supply chain, particularly Oregon-based companies who are manufacturing wood products in the state with a supply chain in the state, you're going to have that tax over and over and over as it builds up, and it will be far more than just the 0.57. And so, you know, I think while we did some good on housing affordability, we also did some damage with this particular bill and could have done even more damage with some of the other bills that are on the list as well.
Yeah, and you know, Sean's example of the nonprofits playing out across both public and private sector, and you've seen several news stories about how it's going to impact public sector projects. You know, you have school districts that pass school bonds trying to be accountable to a particular spending target for the repairs and replacements of their school buildings, and they can't meet those targets now, and these costs are going up significantly. And this also is happening at the same time that the Portland gross receipts tax, which is a full 1%, is being interpreted to apply to construction and other activities as well, when it was intended to only apply to retail sales of large retailers. So gross receipts taxation, not clear why it's become a popular thing. It's one of the least equitable ways to tax. Most jurisdictions across the world have moved away from it, but the insatiable demand for revenue has brought it back to Oregon. So,
and I almost chimed in on your legislative priorities at the beginning. What we didn't see there, the big glaring thing we didn't see as a priority, was addressing our $26+ billion PERS hole. And so I think in PERS, for those folks who don't follow the legislature every day, bless your hearts for the record, because it's sort of an illness that we have, but it's our public employee retirement system. We made some deals in the early 80s and 90s that the state simply cannot afford. And it's one of the driving forces why you see this need for increased revenue every single session. And I know in Jeremy's former life, the $2.8 billion per biennium that just came in with this new gross receipts tax is going to be eaten up pretty quickly unless we do further structural reforms to the PERS system. And effectively, people will be paying all this money just to pay retirees, and it won't make it to the classroom yet again.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. We'll talk about what they did, some very small things that they did do on PERS this session. Affordable home ownership, House Bill 3349, this was another attempt to reduce and eliminate the mortgage interest deduction. So this particular version of the bill would have eliminated mortgage interest deduction for second homes, would have phased it out for first homes for taxpayers beginning at $200,000 in income, and then completely phased it out for $250,000 in income or above. We were able to keep this one at bay, but of course, this is an issue that pops up pretty much every legislative session, and we expect that it will again in the future.
Yeah, and it's gotten more traction the last few years, and the numbers have changed always as far as where you're cut off, but previous iterations of the bill said that folks who are mega wealthy, defined as $125,000 a year, which those of us who live in the Portland metropolitan region know is not even remotely close to mega wealthy, but it actually would cut off single homeowners from their mortgage interest deduction at that low of a threshold. And even on these bills where, you talked about a little higher thresholds this time, Jeremy, and the elimination of second homes, if they get that opportunity, the very next session, I assure you, they'll lower it down again and again, and we will be fighting to protect the mortgage interest deduction. I know Jeremy is sort of taking lead on a PAG, a presidential advisory group, that's looking at what's most important to our members as we engage on our advocacy campaigns. And I think we thought we knew that members cared a lot about mortgage interest deduction, but certainly the data bears that out. And I'm happy to see that folks do realize the value of the mortgage interest deduction, and fighting to preserve it in Oregon will be something that we continue to do.
Yeah. And Sean's talking about a survey that we did recently, and so we appreciate that that all of those of you that took that survey to provide input into our advocacy efforts, because we'll be using that to set our direction heading forward. So I'll talk a little bit about the priority that passed in the DEQ budget. This was the septic replacement program, that failed.
Yeah, so
I apologize about the slide here.
Well, no, there's both in there. So we talk a lot each session about wood stoves and septic, and this has sort of been an issue where the state has wanted to mandate either replacements or significant upgrades at the point of sale, and we are reticent to support additional costs on home sellers at the point of sale, and think that we'd be better suited to actually address the issue while folks are in their homes, particularly in more rural properties that don't turn over as much. And so we have supported for a number of years additional funds to either go out in low or no interest loans or grants for folks to either upgrade their septic or replace their wood stove to conforming wood stoves. And you've sort of seen this push every session. So a typical session will ask for a couple $1 million for each. The DEQ budget did actually have some money for wood stoves, which was good. It's still not enough. I think we got $500,000. And that goes pretty quickly in non-attainment areas like Klamath Falls and Oak Ridge. And Washington County actually has a pretty significant program now too. And then on the septic side, it's the same thing. And I think the biggest change that we've had on septic is for folks who are actually in an area where they could connect to sewer now, but they have a septic system that's failing but not at a significant level. The law mandates that they connect to the sewer system at usually a cost of $25,000, where they could probably fix their septic for $1,000. And what ends up happening is they don't do anything instead. And so we're really trying to make sure that the funds are available so that people will be able to connect to the sewer if at all possible, and avoid future point of sale mandates.
Great. And just to be clear on the wood stove funding passed, but this time around the septic funding did not pass, right?
Yeah.
All right, so there, talking about some land use, property rights bills. There was quite a few bills related to what you can do with your property, particularly if it's in a zone other than a residential zone. And so House Bill 2469, this was a bill to allow for a second dwelling for a relative on forest zone land. So this bill would expand the ability to have a second dwelling on forest zone land if it's for a relative and if that relative is assisting the owner with their forest operations. 2225, this was a bill that we opposed, but it did pass. Now this bill limits allowable forest template dwellings. So I'm not sure how familiar you all are with the template dwelling statute.
Everyone has read the entire statute, front to back.
But this bill modifies or is attempted to clarify what it means, what the center of the tract means, and this is how it's determined if and where you can have a forest template dwelling. And it also has some other limitations in there on when a forest template dwelling is allowable.
Yeah, I'd say if the three land use nerds who are on the webinar with us, we're happy to get into the technical details of this bill. It does have a variety of different effective dates. And so if you have clients who potentially could be impacted by this and have a potential template dwelling, they need to start acting now because some of their platted templates are actually no longer going to be eligible. And some of the lot line adjustments that were used in the past to be able to get a template dwelling are no longer going to be allowable starting in mid 2020 and rolling through. So if you do sort of delve into the rural landowner development field, you definitely sort of want to take a look at those dates if you have clients who are going to pursue that.
So Senate Bill 88, this is one we had a question about. This would allow for accessory dwelling units in rural residential zones. And this was a priority for us. Unfortunately, it didn't pass. There was a work group that worked on this issue in the interim, and we were hopeful that it would pass this session, and we worked with many partners on trying to pass it. What happened was that the bill got a fiscal note attached to it so that it became something that costs money, and that makes it more difficult to pass things. It goes then to the Ways and Means process. And the reason why it got a fiscal was because there was discussion in the hearings of the bill about the need to ensure that new dwelling units in rural residential zones are not creating additional wildfire risk, and there was a desire to do some mapping of wildfire risks, and they kind of lumped that in with this bill and attached a fiscal note to pay for that work. Then when it went to Ways and Means, it did not elevate to the priority to get funding. But this is an area where we plan to prioritize efforts heading forward and try to get this thing passed within the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think this is a perfect example of the urban versus rural divide going on in our state. I think we were very supportive of urban property owners being allowed to have an ADU on their property. And we felt like rural residential folks should have that same opportunity, particularly if they want a family member to be able to move onto their property as well. I think the conservation advocates are strongly opposed to that. And so you saw them not only fighting this bill, but ultimately putting in that poison pill of the wildfire mapping, simply as an attempt to derail the bill. And they were successful this time. But as you mentioned, Jeremy, that will be a priority for us coming back in the 2021 session. Where we will continue to advocate for ADUs in rural residential areas.
And Kayla, did that answer the question that was asked?
Yeah, they just wanted to know if you were going to bring it up.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you. 2436. So this is something that's been talked about on and off over the years related to wetlands removal fill permits. So this is a permit issued by the federal government, but the state has the ability to assume the responsibilities for managing the permit program. And like I said, over the years, it's been discussed whether that would be advantageous or not, and it hadn't moved forward. But this session, a bill did pass that would require legislation to be brought back to the 2020 session that would be for the partial assumption of the program as it relates to development activities inside UGB, mining related activities, and the creation and operation of wetland mitigation banks. So it's not a full assumption, but a partial assumption of the wetlands removal fill 404 permit program.
And yeah, this not really a housing issue, more a private property rights issue, particularly for farmers. They were very interested in all the wetlands bills. This particular bill got a little bit of press too because the governor threatened to veto it at one point in time. I think the actual policy change that was significant coming out of this one is they called it the ditch cleanup. Effectively, farmers, when they're cleaning out their irrigation ditches, they're limited to 50 cubic yards of dirt before they have to go get a 404 permit. This would allow them to go up to 3,000 on there. You know, it was because cap and trade failed. Sorry to jump ahead in our slides if folks didn't know that. The environmental community was quite upset and was looking for any hostage to take in the final days of session. You had a bipartisan work group that worked on this, and that same bipartisan group of legislators went to the governor and implored her not to veto it, and ultimately she didn't, which was not a sure thing by any stretch in the end.
A couple more bills on that. As we stay on that one for a moment, a couple more bills on land use. So that we didn't get onto the slide. Senate Bill 2, this is a bill that OAR supported that allows for increased flexibility in the land use system for Eastern Oregon counties as it relates to economic development. So 10 Eastern Oregon counties, Baker, Gilliam, Grant, Harney, Lake, Malheur, Sherman, Union, Wallowa, and Wheeler are allowed under this bill to conduct an economic opportunity analysis outside of their urban growth boundary as part of their comprehensive plan. And then each county can have 50 acres to divide into as many as 10 different parcels for economic development opportunities without taking an exception to statewide land use goals and without the Land Conservation and Development Department's approval. So we supported the bill. It did pass. There was some funding associated with it to help the counties in this process, and that funding was going to go to the Association of Oregon Counties. And that was actually vetoed by the governor. She argued that funding should go through DLCD, not through AOC. So she vetoed that a couple weeks ago. Not clear how important that funding was, given that many of these counties don't have a lot of staff and need a lot of technical assistance help with these kind of things. It probably was very important. The governor indicated that she'd be open to the funding if it came through DLCD, and so we'll be exploring opportunities to find other ways of funding this program.
And I think that nothing demonstrates the difficulty of passing changes to our land use system more than this bill. This bill was introduced 3 sessions in a row by the Senate president himself before it finally got passed. And we're talking about 10 counties with 50 acres each that they can go outside their urban growth boundaries. So we're talking about a grand total of 500 acres in the state of Oregon, and the conservation community argue that this would undermine our entire state land use system for many years on it. And it just sort of shows the absurdity of what we're dealing with here. Very good that it did get passed, but then you ultimately saw the funding get stripped from it and in a continuation of that fight. And, you know, these 10 counties in particular have been losing population. They are having a difficult time with their kids staying in the communities in which they were raised when they want to reach the age of going out and working. And so, you know, I think hopefully we see more than just token help to our rural parts of the state that have not prospered like our urban parts of the state have.
Another one on this list that we didn't include on the slide is House Bill 3024. This is related to replacement dwellings on exclusive farm use land. 3024 clarifies the circumstances under which a current or former dwelling may be replaced. on EFU land, and it really expands those opportunities. There was a lot of confusion. I think it was a 2013 bill that was passed that was intended to clarify this issue, but it actually created a tremendous amount of confusion, including some court cases. And so this bill clears things up and makes it a little bit easier for the opportunity to build a replacement dwelling.
Yeah, effectively what we're talking about is homes that were built pre-Senate Bill 100 that are out there, farmhouses that would allow you to actually have a house. And the real controversy around it, one, for many years our land use system has encouraged farmers to just keep these dilapidated houses standing out there in order to get that replacement dwelling. And for a number of years, actually, you had to keep it standing. This new bill actually is a benefit. So if you previously had a house that had running water and electricity going to it, and you can demonstrate that it existed there, you can replace it. And I think that was a huge win this session to get that.
All right, move on to the next category here. So regulation of the realtor profession. So a bill that didn't pass, and Sean mentioned this earlier, and we know it's a major priority for many of you on the call and the industry in general. House Bill 2498, this would have changed the definition of independent contractor, and it would have required that the worker does not provide services that are within the usual course of the other person's business. So essentially it would have been a very extreme limitation on the ability to be an independent contractor as opposed to an employee. The bill didn't move forward. Sean, worked very hard on this and working with the bill sponsor. And I know that even if it had moved forward, I think it would have excluded realtors. But this is another issue that we expect will probably keep coming forward in future legislative sessions.
Yeah, I think independent contractor status has been an expanding scope that particularly trade unions are upset. They feel like folks are being classified as independent contractors when they're really employees to get around workplace mandates. And we sort of got caught in the crosshairs, quite frankly, of people going after Uber drivers. But the bill was so expansive that, as you mentioned, Jeremy, effectively every single broker in a brokerage would have become an employee and subject to the complete control of their principal broker. And so we did have significant concerns with the bill. I know the state chambers were very involved in their calls to action too, and a number of our members forward that on. The only reason we didn't do a call to action is we did have assurance from the chair that he would have modified the bill if it was going to move forward. And we continue to enjoy a strong relationship with Paul Holvey from Eugene on at least listening to our concerns on workplace regulation. And he actually reached out the other day to say he wants to put together a work group to talk about this during legislative days, which will be next month. And so we will be engaged in that work group to make sure that independent contractors, which most of you on the phone are, or on the webinar are, that you don't inadvertently get swept into this.
So other important housing related bills, we'll talk about 2312. This is an important one for everyone to be aware of. So this bill modified the seller's disclosure statute and the required disclosure statement. And the phrase that's going to be added is that flood insurance may be required for homes in a floodplain. So this just puts buyers on notice that flood insurance may be required. Initially, there were much more expansive changes to the seller's disclosure statement that were proposed as it relates to flood insurance. And some of them were pretty burdensome and required information that may not be easily accessible. So we were able to amend these a bit, get at the heart of what the legislature was trying to do without adding a lot of extra burden for the sellers.
Yeah, this bill is the perfect example of what the legislature does best, nothing and overreact. And so you get one constituent who calls a legislator who says, I didn't realize I had to have flood insurance and it's really expensive. We should do something about that. So they'll introduce a bill that changes our seller's property disclosure and has 10 different questions on it, and it becomes problematic. Now, this particular representative did what we view as sort of the right thing and approached us early on and said, I want to do this. We were able to talk him down and sort of simplify the language. Quite frankly, in the end, the Senate changed it to still, I think, kind of a mess of language. The question should have read what we agreed to originally was, have you ever purchased flood insurance? And now it's just going to be this warning. But anyone who is a responsible realtor on the phone knows that as part of your client service, you're probably going to highlight that to your buyer and say, hey, look, this is particularly if they've checked it on the seller's property disclosure that it's in a floodplain, that there is a flood insurance that's likely going to be required, and you're going to want to do your due diligence on how much that flood insurance is. Assuming that we can continue to keep the National Flood Insurance Program going, Jeremy will get the joy of going back to DC with me, where we beg for 3-month extensions at a time of NFIP, and then every once in a while we'll get a 5-year extension, and by the time the 5-year extension has run out, of course, we're begging again every 3 months. So for those who do the Hill visits in DC in May, we will, of course, be pushing for continued extension of the flood insurance program.
Then the Housing and Community Services budget, this is a state agency. We talked about some of the things that are in there already today, but there was an effort to significantly increase funding for housing and homelessness related issues through the Department of Housing and Community Services budget. So in addition to some of the things that we've talked about already, there was about $330 million in additional funding, including about $70 million for homelessness assistance and prevention, $206 million for affordable housing related programs, and $54 million for permanent supportive housing programs. If you go to the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department website, you can learn a lot more about those funding sources and programs, and they have several summaries on their website of what happened this legislative session. So now we're going to talk about some stuff that we didn't really take positions on. We monitored these issues, but they weren't core OAR issues. A lot of other groups were working on these, but they did really help define the 2019 legislative session. The first, House Bill 2020, this is the carbon cap and trade bill. Didn't pass ultimately, but it definitely took a lot of oxygen out of the legislative session.
No pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no pun. It would have put a cap on carbon emissions, and then those would be, emissions permits would be issued and be traded, and it would price carbon. And the major effect would be increases in prices for transportation fuels, increases in prices for home heating fuel, and then increases in costs for industrial users. And I'll let Sean chime in because he worked quite a bit on this bill in another capacity.
I think this is one of those ones, given the level of involvement from citizens coming down to a scale I've never seen, where they had a pretty significant protest at the Capitol where log trucks and tractors and bale wagons and everything else were lined up for 6 straight hours going to the Capitol. You had thousands of people coming because they really were concerned about their livelihood and what impact this bill would have on them. It disproportionately, and the legislative analysis demonstrated it disproportionately impacted rural residents who don't necessarily have the opportunities around public transit, who drive longer distances, who work in farm and forest and are impacted significantly by diesel costs. And then, they, if they're lucky, work for a good family wage manufacturer who uses a significant amount of natural gas. And so, I think you saw some pretty strong pushback from those areas of the state. I think ultimately that led to the 11 Senate Republicans at the time, due to the passing of Senator Winters leaving the state. If you all have sort of tracked the news, I think it's become more and more clear that the Senate Democrats actually didn't have the votes to pass the bill as it sat anyway, even if the Republicans were there. And this to me is the most emblematic of the inability of the majority to concede any concessions to the minority, because there were amendments drafted by rural Democrats, 2 rounds of them, that could have achieved 95% of the goals of the bill, that were compromises in certain areas. And the advocates, and in particular the governor, were unwilling to accept any changes to the program whatsoever. And that inability to accept any changes to address the concerns of rural Oregonians ultimately led to the bill not going forward. And I think it probably did significant damage. You know, this is not a realtor issue. You know, obviously it's a statewide issue that does impact all Oregonians, but it wasn't one that we specifically focused on. But I think, you know, it is something that will certainly come back. You will see the impacts around home heating and transportation fuels in particular highlighted as we move forward on it.
So House Bill 2005, this is a bill that did pass and was one of the priorities of the legislative leaders heading into the session. And this was a paid family and medical leave program. So, you know, with the passage of 2005, Oregon joined Washington, California, and a handful of other states in requiring employers to provide a paid family and medical leave benefit. So the law allows eligible employees to receive paid leave for up to 12 weeks for their own serious health condition or for parental leave or other family care. And that begins in 2023. The program's funded through premiums, which are essentially payroll taxes on employers and employees. The exact amount is still going to be determined in rulemaking, but the bill states that it's not to exceed 1% total of an employee's wages. The premiums will start being collected in 2022. Employers that have 25 employees or more will contribute 40% of the premium. Their employees will contribute 60%. Employees with fewer than 25 employees are not required to contribute the 40% from the employer, but their employees will contribute. Many details are still to be worked out. There'll be a lot of rulemaking and efforts over the next couple of years to get the details worked out. But as I mentioned, the program will start being paid for in 2022, and benefits will be able to start being accessed in 2023.
And it's notable in that it's been highlighted as the most progressive family leave program in the country by national pundits. And I think as I was doing a little lawyer math over here, which means it's wrong, you got 1.5 billion in new costs on employers under this paid family leave. You have an additional 2.8 billion in gross receipts taxes, and you have around 500 million in the new Medicaid tax for employers who provide healthcare to their employees. So that's almost $5 billion every 2 years that the legislature increased taxes on Oregon businesses this session. And thankfully, the economy is still humming along at the moment, but as we dip into the next recession that is likely to come, it will be very interesting to see how these significant tax increases bear out.
Yep. And then that brings us, of course, to an issue that Sean brought up earlier, which is 1049. This is PERS. As Sean mentioned, one of the major reasons why you're seeing a lot of tax increases is because of the ongoing and increasing costs of PERS, which is taking money that otherwise would be available for other public services away from those services and into paying down the debt inside the pension fund. And the way that this works is that basically if you're a public employer in the state, school district, city, county, state agency, special district, all of those employers have a PERS liability associated with their former and current employees. And the state's PERS board and their actuaries will determine how much money needs to be paid into the system to be able to pay for that obligation. As Sean mentioned earlier, right now we have about $27 billion unfunded liability. That's the gap between the resources that we have available and what's needed to pay for what we owe. And what happens is that the rates that these public jurisdictions pay for PERS, it's a payroll charge. It just goes up automatically to match what's needed to close that gap. And so historically, you'd see a city or a county or a school district paying about 12% of their payroll costs towards PERS. Now it's 25%, it's heading to 30%. And so all that money that otherwise would have been available for other things now has to get diverted to PERS. And so there was a lot of focus this session on what, if anything, to do about it. The business community was advocating heavily for significant reforms to PERS so that tax dollars could go to the services that they were intended for. The legislative leaders and the governor, I think, with significant pressure, agreed that something needed to happen, but they didn't go nearly as far as some folks were advocating. So they passed Senate Bill 1049. This bill does require employees to contribute some portion of their salary to their own pension costs. This is intended to offset some of the costs that employers would otherwise have to pay. So that is between 0.75% of salary and 2.5% of salary, depending on when the employee came into the system. So the newer employees pay 0.75%, the older employees 2.5%. So what you had seen in some of the draft legislation from some of the Republicans and some of the things that the business community was pushing for was more around 6%. So this was a small fraction of that. The bill also refinanced the debt. So it extended the period over which the debt is going to be paid off by about 8 years. And that, of course, reduced the annual payments, but extends the life of the problem and adds costs, essentially adds carrying costs. So employers will see relief. The impact on the budget won't be as significant in the short term as it otherwise would have been, but initially there was hope that this problem would go away by 2030, 2035 or so, and it's probably going to be with us much longer than that.
So effectively, we got a brand new $26 billion credit card that's got lower interest rate for a little while. And so that's why we're kicking the can down the road. The last thing that we had on there, which I think will be more of an issue in 2020 as we see what it looks like. But the legislature in the final days of session did kick out a potential constitutional amendment to the voters. It will be on the ballot in November 2020. To implement some form of campaign finance reform. So in years past, the voters of Oregon actually did approve campaign finance reform, in particular campaign limits to individual legislators, and those were overturned by the state Supreme Court due to Oregon's expansive First Amendment. So I think we will see in 2020 sort of what those limits look like, because the legislature put out the referral without any actual limits in place in there as far as what we're looking at. As all of our dutiful RPAC investors on the webinar know, campaigns have become increasingly expensive to run in the Oregon Legislative Assembly, and it is not uncommon for an individual candidate to spend $1 million for a job that pays $22,000 a year, which strikes many of us as completely absurd. So let's see more to come on that one. I think, OAR is well positioned no matter how this plays out. And we can look to our neighbors in the north, the Washington realtors, who are subject to very tight campaign limitations. And they do a lot of support for candidates independent of the candidate themselves. And I think we would follow their lead if that's the route that Oregon voters ultimately decide. Jeremy, I was going to do one other thing too, because it's not on your list. Mm-hmm. Did you want to talk about your economic development committee that you're launching?
Yeah, sure. So OAR is launching an economic development committee. This will be a new thing, and we're looking for members. And so if you're interested, shoot me an email, and my contact information is at the end of the presentation here. The committee will help educate OAR members about economic development and how to get engaged in economic development in their community. We're producing a resource guide for that. We're going to try to get more Realtor members plugged in to the economic development organizations in their community and their chambers of commerce and other efforts locally. We're going to use the committee to help bubble up economic development legislative priorities to present to the Government Affairs Key Committee for inclusion in the OAR legislative agenda. And then the committee will oversee some of the grant opportunities that that the National Association of Realtors has related to economic development. So NAR has grant opportunities related to Main Street development, related to housing needs analyses and other things, and other community development opportunities. And we're going to try to boost our acquisition of those grants and encourage our local associations to be getting those grants.
Great.
Okay, Realtor Day at the Capitol. You see some pictures here. And I do want to talk about the pictures for a minute because I think it's pretty awesome. You see the large assembly there, more than 800 realtors. As I mentioned before, I don't think I'm quite positive, no other industry group can turn out people like this. And even if the public employee unions held an event or a rally, I think that the number of people that we turn out here is pretty much unparalleled. We, at the event, participants received education and training related to lobbying, related to bills that were working their way through or had passed. We had nearly 90 meetings with legislators. So we had teams of realtors from their communities visiting with their House members and Senate members. The governor came and visited and spoke with the group. So this is something we do every 2 years. We're gonna try to hit 1,000 realtors at the 2021 event. We hope that you participate. Again, reach out to me and we can get you some more information about how to get involved in that. John, you wanna say anything?
No, the one thing I would say is, as you're looking at that screen and the length of that tent, having been around for all the years of that tent, that's as far as the tent will go in the Capitol grounds. And they actually added more and more extensions this year. It was amazing to see. And we actually went back up steps again. Even the Salem Brew Fest doesn't have a tent that large. So we've surpassed beer. I think that's a pretty good thing.
So some other ways that you can get involved. Of course, the Realtor Political Action Committee, Sean mentioned, our participation in elections allows us to build relationships, to maintain the ability for an open door and conversations with legislators about key issues. We have an influential political action committee, and that really does help our ability to shape things, and we need to be able to maintain that. So thank you all for your contribution to RPAC. If you ever have any questions about RPAC, becoming a major investor, or other opportunities, please reach out. We would love for you to continue your participation and step up your involvement if that's of interest to you.
Yeah, and I think several things on RPAC. One, we support the Realtor Party, not Republicans or Democrats. And so while we had a difficult session this time, particularly with Senate Bill 608, there still were a number of Democrats, particularly in the Senate, the RPAC remains strongly supportive of, and a number of Republicans as well. So I think, I have always joked every time we send out an RPAC message, the very first 2 emails I get are from each side saying, I'm not giving you a dime, you give too much to Republicans. And then the next person says, I'm not giving you a dime, you give too much to Democrats. Hopefully it's like the Goldilocks and the 3 bears that we got the porridge just right. The RPAC trustees, who are comprised of realtors from throughout the state, and who represent not only most of the large associations in our state, but some of the smaller ones as well, ultimately make those determinations. And just for flavor, we just approved the first round of support in the Senate coming out of the session. And we had 5 Republicans we supported and 4 Democrats. So pretty much keeping in line with that balance that we're hoping to achieve. And, you know, I have told folks repeatedly, I have been through Republican-led assemblies, I've been through Democratic-led assemblies, and to me, the most effective assembly that we've ever had, particularly from the realtor perspective, was when they were tied 30-30, and both parties actually had to work together and talk to each other. Sort of a forgotten thing these days in Salem, but it really was exceptional. And even in the Senate, it was only 16-14, and the Senate president decided to divide up a lot of the committees evenly. So balance is what we're looking for in the state, and I think that's what RPAC is all about, is those legislators who bring a balanced perspective, particularly around housing issues, and you know, we appreciate them.
So another, we mentioned Realtor Day at the Capitol already. Another major way to help influence the outcome of the legislative session is by participating in calls for action. Thank you all for those who did that actively this session, where we had several related to rent control, to mortgage interest deduction, to House Bill 2001 and other issues. These calls for action help to make it clear that it's not just the lobbyists in the building that are concerned about a particular issue, but that the constituents of legislators really care. There's some information in your materials that went out that lets you know how to sign up for calls for action if you're not receiving them, and how to get texts, which create an easy and efficient way to do that. Also, I want to talk about the broker involvement program. Now they call it the broker involvement program at NAR, but it's really would be the managing principal broker involvement program here in Oregon. And the idea is that if a managing principal broker signs up for this, then the calls for action go out to the brokers and their brokerage from the managing principal broker. And what that does is it really increases the participation rate. So it's not just coming from some random person at NAR or OAR.
Random person, we matter. Come on, Jeremy.
So we encourage you to sign up for that if you're eligible, and if you're not, to encourage your managing principal broker to sign up for that. You know, we also have goals that we're trying to achieve in terms of our response to call for action, both at state level issues and on federal issues, and more participation in that program would really help us hit those targets. Next thing, key constituent program. This is something that we're building out, really trying to create a team of folks who maintain a relationship with their state House member and state senator. And this would be not only utilized for Realtor Day at the Capitol, but as an ongoing opportunity to have conversations with legislators about important issues to realtors. And so if this is something that's of interest to you, if you have a relationship with a legislator that you think you could be helpful in participating in this program, or if you're interested in building one, reach out to me and I'll talk to you more about that, and we can get you plugged into that program. Another thing, another way to get involved, the deadline is passed for this time around, but next year is always an opportunity, and hopefully many of you already signed up for this year, is joining an OAR committee. We talked about the Government Affairs Committee, which really sets the legislative agenda, the Political Affairs Committee, which plans Realtor Day at the Capitol, also helps plan candidate trainings, other grassroots activities of the association, and they'll also be in charge of the key constituent program. And then the RPAC trustees, which both helps to raise money for RPAC and makes decisions about where those investments will go in terms of candidates. So we hope that you get more engaged. It's going to continue to be more and more important as the political environment is difficult right now. We're going to try to bring balance back, but your involvement is so important, because while we may not be random people here, the reality is that staff and lobbyists, legislators hear from them every day. And we're effective, but not nearly as effective as you are when you reach out to your legislators.
And just a plug for our annual conference, it's October 1st through 3rd at the lovely Salem Convention Center. These committees will be meeting, and so if folks want to drop in and watch and see sort of what the committees do and provide input, all the government affairs meetings when we have them, a number of folks and political affairs as well at the convention we had solicit input from folks. And I don't know if we talked about it on this, but we will have the legislative conference coming up next year. The legislative conference is the opportunity for everyone on this webinar and everyone at their local associations to sort of provide input in what they think OAR's priorities will be. And I think you'll see at the beginning of the year sort of that push electronically from members to solicit input as we build the legislative priorities and agenda for 2021. Sadly, Jeremy and I will be back in the Capitol in a couple of weeks already. So there really is no rest now. We've become a year-round legislative assembly effectively, and we'll continue to work on those 2020 issues and 21.
Great. Any final questions? All right.
There's Jeremy's email. His personal cell phone number is.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for participating. Please do reach out to me with any questions, concerns, interest in getting involved in anything we've talked about. We'd love to have that conversation with you. Thank you.